I'm going to start with a reading by a Chicano poet named Jimmy Santiago Baca. The name of this poem is I Am Offering This Poem. This could be a birthday present to Angel. I am offering this poem to you, since I have nothing else to give. Keep it like a warm coat when winter comes to cover you, or like a pair of thick socks the cold cannot bite through. I love you. I have nothing else to give you, so it is a pot full of yellow corn to warm your belly in winter. It is a scarf for your head to wear over your hair to tie up around your face. I love you. Keep it. Treasure this as you would if you were lost, needing direction in the wilderness life becomes when mature. And in the corner of your drawer, tucked away like a cabin or hogan, in dense trees, come knocking, and I will answer, give you directions, and let you warm yourself by this fire, rest by this fire, and make you feel safe. I love you. It is all I have to give, and all anyone needs to live, and to go on living inside when the world outside no longer cares if you live or die. Remember, I love you. Good morning, everybody. I want to thank Kent for inviting me to speak today. And like he said, I have had the joy and privilege of chairing this Child Spiritual Development Committee here at USG, and I'm also a professor of education at Arcadia. You may also not know or know I am a lifelong resident here of Mount Airy in Germantown, and I live here with my husband, John, and my son, Jules. And yes, John is the John of John and Kira's, who makes the most delicious chocolates. But I digress. So today I'm here to talk to you about two intertwined ideas. One is restoring ourselves, and the other is restoring ourselves. And I'm here to suggest that when we work to rewrite the stories that others, about ourselves and others, about who we are and what we can be, then we also work to restore hope and create healing in our communities. So before I go into all of that, I want to start with a story of my own. So I went to elementary school not too far from here at John B. Kelly, which is in Pulaski and Hansberry Streets. And I went during the 1980s, which was kind of the height of the desegregation movement. It was this time of really great diversity in the schools, and I really, it was a really wonderful time to be in that school. My teacher there was Lynn Strebe, who is continues to be a colleague of mine to this day and a mentor to me this day. And she was just, and still is, an extraordinary teacher. She's the kind of teacher, she would take notes on children every single day. At the end of the day, she would spend hours compiling the notes just so that she, for herself, would know children better, so that she could teach them better, right? So she really had that dedication to getting to know kids. And so one day, Mrs. Strebe, who I still think of her as Mrs. Strebe in my head, even though she's my mentor. One day, Mrs. Strebe found out that some of the kids were teasing each other because of the ways that their names sounded, or the different kinds of names that existed in our classroom. And she made it pretty clear that that was not acceptable. And I think most teachers would kind of just make, hey guys, that's not cool, let's not do that anymore. But she took it a step further because she wanted to create a kind of healing in our classroom. So what she decided to do was give us all a project. And our project was we had to go back home and ask our parents, why did we get our name? Where did our name come from? What's the story of our name? Right? So we all went home, we asked our parents, and our parents dictated to us. We wrote these stories down, we brought them in, and she typed them all up, okay? And then we illustrated them. And then for each typed page and illustration, she put it together into a book. And then she sat down and she read the book to us. And I will tell you that I was 6 years old at that time, but I still remember the names in that book. There was the child with the Japanese name, who was named by the grandparent who had been held in the Japanese internment camps. And she was given a strong Japanese name because that grandparent wanted her to stand strong in the face of discrimination. Her name was Michiko. The child whose parents took years and years and years to have a child, and they were so happy that they had her. Her name was Joy. The child who was named after the color of the sunrise that his mother saw as he was born, Rusty. The child who was named because he was adopted and his parents felt such joy in finding him, and his name was Moses. We became human to each other on that day. Our names had great meaning to us, and we understood why then. And many of us had not even realized why they were so important at that point. So on that day, we became a more caring community through telling our stories. You see, stories are not just words on a page or made-up fantasies. Stories are actually what define us as human beings. There's a psychologist named Pamela Rutledge who I think did a really good job in describing what stories really are. She said, stories are how we think. They are how we make meaning of life. Some call them schemas, some call them scripts, cognitive maps, mental models, metaphors, narratives. Stories are how we explain how things work, how we make decisions, how we justify our decisions, how we persuade others, how we understand our place in the world, how we create our identities, and how we teach each other social values. So it's not really hard to see how important stories to us. When you go to sleep at night, your brain tells itself stories. We make media of every kind, books, TV, plays, art, just to tell each other stories. And every faith that we have has its own set of stories that have messages that teach us how to treat each other and also how to take care of ourselves. So, question is, if this is true about stories, then think for a minute, what happens when we have power over telling stories about who we are? And conversely, what happens when we don't? So these are really important to think about on two different levels, kind of a personal level and a societal level. And I want to start with the personal first. If you study mindfulness, and Kent just kind of did a nice mindfulness exercise with us, one of the things you learn is that we all have stories that are going through our heads constantly. Sometimes we see them, sometimes we don't. When we're doing mindfulness and meditation, we kind of look at those stories, we look at those narratives. Some of those thoughts might be, nobody here likes me, or I don't know how to do math, or I'm a great singer. They're all stories. They're all kind of our internal theories about who we are. So what mindfulness does is it teaches you to be aware of those stories and be aware of how those stories shape our feelings and our decisions. And also to know that we can't shut those off. That's how our brain works. But we can observe them, and once we see them, then we can choose whether or not we want to change our story. So what happens when you have a story going through your head and you don't see it, you don't seek out those possibilities? What happens? Well, I actually have a story from Jimmy Santiago Baca, the poet that I just read, that kind of gives an example of that, of what happens. So he is now a very nationally renowned poet, but in his youth, he had been incarcerated and had spent several years in jail for a crime that he hadn't committed. At that same time in jail, he was illiterate. And he pretty much expected his entire life to be one of crime or jail. And the story that he told himself in his head was, I'm powerless, I have no future, I'm ignorant. But in jail, he started to learn how to read. And during that time when he was in jail, he found this book on Chicano history, his people's history. And he started to read about Chicano heroes and warriors who he had never heard of before. And he realized he didn't know that Chicano heroes could exist. So something awakened in him at that point. And when you read his biography, you hear him talk about how these stories made him begin to change his own internal story of himself. He thought to himself, you know what? I can be a poet. I can be a Chicano hero. So once that changed, he started writing poetry, and he started to rewrite the story in his head, his own personal story, and that really changed kind of the course of his life. And he wrote in his biography about this process of writing poetry and this process of realizing or changing his own story. And he said, through language I was free. I could respond, escape, indulge, embrace or reject the earth or the cosmos. I was launched on an endless journey without boundaries or rules in which I could salvage the floating fragments of my past or be born anew. So in the same way, there's a Nigerian author named Chimamanda Adichie who's been made famous recently because of her renowned TED Talk. TED is one of these kind of famous talks that's on the internet you see played over and over again. Hers is probably the most played TED Talk that's out there. And her TED Talk is about her experience coming to the United States as a freshman in college. She gives a little background too, growing up in Nigeria, but she has this very poignant story. When she came to the U.S. As a freshman, she met her freshman roommate. And her roommate had this kind of single story or idea about what Africans are or were, right? So what she had was this narrative of Africans are only farmers, or they live in the jungle, or they're poor, right? And so when she met Adichie, she was very confused. She couldn't imagine there was a Nigerian who had been brought up in a very kind of intellectual and academic experience in life, and that she was coming to this university and brought all this knowledge. And she assumed that Adichie was just ignorant. So this was really upsetting to Adichie. And she felt that this narrative, this larger narrative, this story about who Africans are, had somehow affected her individually, right? It made other people underestimate her and exclude her. And in her talk, she talks about how when you cling to this single story about a people, it's not only affecting yourself and your personal decisions, like what happened to Jimmy Santiago Baca, but it also can affect entire groups of people, right? That these stories are recognizing the multiplicity of stories is so important. So here's a quote from her. She says, "Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity." So it's not just people who need to work to restore themselves in order to change. Communities actually need to get together and tell stories that repair dignity and empower and humanize. And it's oftentimes that we're so bound to single stories that we don't realize our own potential. So I'll ask you to think a little bit about the community that surrounds itself in monuments of white supremacy, and what kind of identity that starts to cultivate, what kind of narrative that starts to cultivate in the community. And how communities that are brave enough to restore themselves and seek the truth often face resistance, as we saw in Charlottesville. But when you see those kinds of false narratives and monuments fall, you also realize how it's worth it. And so I'll quote the mayor of Charlottesville, Michael Signer, who told reporters about his town. He said, "We want to change the narrative by telling the true story of race through public spaces. That has made us a target for groups that hate that change and want to stay in the past. But we will not be intimidated." And he goes on to talk about how it was worth it. It was really important to do that. So it takes testimony, truth-telling, and courage, incredible courage, to restore a community and to restore it. So in my line of work, in education, restoring narratives and kind of trying to empower people through restoring truth and justice is called counter-storytelling. I have two colleagues, Amy Storniello and Ebony Harris at the University of Pennsylvania, who've done a lot of work researching this in the area of education, looking at youth. And they argue that because during this time of connectivity and mass media, there's a lot of, so many stories out there, that it's so important for young people to understand the power of stories and how to engage in counter-storying for social justice. right? That's a really, really significant thing for them to learn and for all of us to learn to do in order to seek social justice empowerment. And in the same vein, some of you may know the name Salman Rushdie, who is also famously had his stories has had an effect on global politics, really, right? And one of his quotes that really moves me is that he says, "Those who do not have power over the story that dominates their lives, the power to retell it, rethink it, deconstruct it, joke about it, and change as times change, truly are powerless, because they cannot think new thoughts." So recently, I did some form of my own counter-storytelling. I wrote a book, as Kent mentioned, recently, Transformative Teachers, about teachers who organize for social justice within and beyond their classroom. And the reason I did this, I wanted to seek out teachers to tell their truths. Because if you look at the bigger media narrative about teachers today, it's a pretty negative tale. Right? You have stories of teachers as being ignorant or conniving or and these aren't true, but this is a narrative that's out there. So my job, I felt, as a counter-storyteller was to lift up the truths and lift up the stories of teachers to create a counter-story, right? And to humanize teachers and to repair the dignity of teachers. And also to provide models for future teachers who may think of themselves in that role, and they want to see those positive stories. So that was an important thing for me, and I want to leave all of you today with a kind of challenge, right? So think of a story or a narrative that oppresses you or others that you really want to change. It could be something personal. Maybe you've been telling yourself something for so long that you've begun to limit yourself and your ability to move forward. There might be something going through your head. You don't even realize it's going through your head, right? You take some meditation time to kind of see that. Or it could be a larger narrative about your neighborhood or about your community or your profession. How can you put out in the world a counter story that serves to empower and humanize? It could be through writing. It could be through art. It can be through music. Right? All of these ways are ways of telling stories. Whatever it is, make sure that it's a truthful story and that it's your story. And because every day, every new day that dawns, you have a new opportunity to restore yourself and ourselves. So on this last Sunday of summer, take the opportunity to begin a new page in your story. So I want to leave you with the lyrics of my son, a favorite song of my son's that he plays around the house, and I keep thinking, wow, it's kind of cool that he likes this song, because I like it too. So the lyrics are, no one else can speak the words on your lips. Drench yourself in words unspoken. Live your life with arms wide open. Today is where your book begins. The rest is still unwritten.